Greetings, traveler. You've arrived at a place where time slows down, and the worries of the day begin to fade. Here, we gather to listen to history told not in haste, but in a gentle rhythm meant to calm the mind. Perhaps you're ready to drift into sleep, or perhaps you simply wish for quiet company tonight. Either way, I'm so glad you're here. Tell me, where are you listening from, and what time of day accompanies your journey back through the ages? And if you find these soft retellings of the past comforting, a simple tap on subscribe ensures you'll never miss another night's tale. Now, breathe deeply, rest easily, and let us step into the stories waiting just beyond the veil of memory. Tonight, we journey to a time when the heavens themselves seem to speak in signs and wonders, when the appearance of a blazing visitor in the night sky could send entire kingdoms into states of prayer and trembling fear. We're traveling back to the Middle Ages, to an era when a comet's tail stretched across the darkness like a flaming sword, and people from peasants in their cottages to kings in their castles looked up and wondered what doom was being written in the stars above them. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself standing in a medieval village as twilight deepens into night. The air is cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke from hearth fires and the earthy smell of fields that have just been turned for planting. Around you, the world is settling into its evening rhythms. You hear the lowing of cattle being led to their barns, the distant bark of a dog, the murmur of voices as families gather for their evening meal. The sky above is darkening from blue to indigo to the deep velvet black of true night, and one by one, the stars begin to appear, those familiar points of light that have guided travelers and marked the passage of seasons since time beyond memory. But tonight, something is different. As you look up at the familiar constellations, the plow, the wagon, the hunter with his belt of 3 bright stars, you notice something that shouldn't be there. A pale smudge of light, faint at first but growing brighter with each passing night. And behind this light, stretching away from it like smoke from a candle flame, is a tail, a ghostly banner that seems to point accusingly at the earth below. A comet has appeared, and with its appearance comes a sense of dread that settles over the village like a cold mist. The fear of comets in the Middle Ages was not a simple superstition, not merely the ignorant terror of people who didn't understand what they were seeing. It was something far more complex, woven from threads of ancient learning, religious belief, political anxiety, and the very real uncertainties of medieval life. To understand why these celestial visitors inspired such profound fear, we need to step back even further in time, to see how the stage was set for medieval comet anxiety long before the Middle Ages began. The story starts, as so many stories do, with the ancient world. The Greeks and Romans, those builders of marble temples and writers of philosophical treatises, had their own complicated relationship with comets. They observed these strange objects carefully, recording their appearances and trying to fit them into their understanding of how the cosmos worked. The Greek word for comet, comets, means long-haired, a description of the tail that streams behind these wandering lights. The Romans called them stella crenita, hairy stars, or sometimes stella cometa, stars with flowing locks. Picture an ancient Greek astronomer, perhaps in Alexandria or Athens, standing on a flat roof under the Mediterranean night, his eyes trained on the heavens. He has spent years learning the movements of the stars, those fixed lights that will overhead in their eternal dance, always maintaining the same patterns, the same relationships to one another. He knows the planets too, those wanderers who move against the background of the fixed stars, following their own mysterious paths through the constellations. But comets are different. They appear without warning, blazing into visibility where no object had been before. They move in ways that seem to follow no pattern, and then, after weeks or months, they fade away, leaving only memory and written records behind. Aristotle, that great systematizer of ancient knowledge, tried to explain comets in his work on meteorology. He placed them not in the celestial sphere, that perfect realm of the planets and stars, but in the upper atmosphere, in the realm of air and weather. In Aristotle's cosmology, the universe was divided into distinct regions. The Earth, imperfect and changeable, sat at the center. Around it were spheres of water, air, and fire. Beyond these terrestrial spheres lay the celestial spheres, perfect and unchanging, where the moon, sun, planets, and stars moved in their appointed courses. Comets, in Aristotle's view, were atmospheric phenomena, exhalations from the earth that caught fire as they rose into the sphere of fire below the moon. This explanation had a certain logic to it, fitting as it did into the broader Aristotelian worldview that would dominate Western thought for centuries. If comets were atmospheric, they belonged to the realm of change and imperfection, not to the eternal heavens. They were weather, not astronomy. But even as Aristotle placed comets in the atmosphere, he acknowledged that they seemed to portend significant events. This is important, even in the ancient world. Even among philosophers who sought natural explanations for phenomena, there was a sense that comets meant something, that they carried messages or warnings. The Romans inherited this mixture of natural philosophy and ominous interpretation from the Greeks. Roman historians like Pliny the Elder compiled extensive records of comet appearances and the events that followed them. Pliny's Natural History, written in the 1st century CE, contains a fascinating section on comets where he describes different types, some with tails, some with beards, some shaped like daggers or javelins. He notes which comets appeared before which disasters, creating a kind of catalogue of celestial warnings. A comet appeared before the assassination of Julius Caesar. Another preceded a plague. Yet another announced the downfall of a great empire or the death of a king. Now, we must be careful here not to dismiss these observations as pure superstition. The Romans were keen observers, and when they noted that certain comets appeared before certain events, they were doing what humans have always done, looking for patterns, trying to find connections between phenomena, attempting to make sense of a world that often seemed chaotic and unpredictable. The problem, of course, is that comets are relatively rare, and dramatic historical events are comparatively common. If you wait long enough after any comet appears, something significant is bound to happen, and the human mind is extraordinarily good at remembering when a prediction seems to come true and forgetting all the times when nothing special occurred at all. But there's more to it than just coincidence and selective memory. In the Roman world, and later in the medieval world, there was a genuine belief that the heavens and the earth were connected, that what happened in the sky could influence or reflect what happened on the ground. This wasn't irrational, it was based on observable fact. The sun's movement through the sky determined the seasons, affecting everything from crop growth to human health. The moon's phases influenced the tides, and many believed they affected everything from plant growth to human behavior. If these regular celestial objects could influence earthly affairs, why not irregular ones like comets? As the Roman Empire gradually transformed into the Christian world of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, these classical ideas about comets didn't disappear. Instead, they were absorbed, reinterpreted, and given new meanings within a Christian framework. The early Christian writers, those men we call the Church Fathers, had to grapple with all the learning of the classical world and decide what could be kept, what must be rejected, and what could be transformed to serve the new faith. St. Augustine, perhaps the most influential of these early Christian thinkers, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, had a nuanced view of celestial signs. He rejected astrology, the idea that the stars could determine human fate, as this seemed to deny human free will and God's sovereignty. But he didn't reject the idea that God might use celestial phenomena to communicate with humanity. After all, the Bible itself spoke of signs in the heavens. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus speaks of signs in the sun, moon, and stars that would precede the end times. The book of Revelation is filled with cosmic imagery, with stars falling from heaven and the moon turning to blood. So comets, in this Christian interpretation, became potential messengers from God. They weren't themselves divine or magical, but they might be instruments through which God chose to warn humanity of coming judgment, to call people to repentance, or to announce significant events in salvation history. This theological framework would shape how comets were understood throughout the Middle Ages. As we move deeper into the medieval period, let's say around the 6th and 7th centuries, we find ourselves in a world that looks very different from the classical civilization that preceded it. The Western Roman Empire has fallen, and in its place has emerged a patchwork of kingdoms ruled by peoples the Romans would have called barbarians: Franks, Goths, Lombards, Anglo-Saxons. Cities have shrunk, long-distance trade has diminished, and literacy has become rare outside of monasteries and the courts of kings. The great libraries of the ancient world have been destroyed or scattered, and much of the learning that had been taken for granted in the Roman world has been lost or preserved only in fragments. Picture a monastery in this early medieval world, perhaps in Ireland or northern England, where the wind from the sea carries the salt smell of the ocean and the cry of gulls. The monastery is a small collection of buildings: a church, a dormitory, workshops, a scriptorium where monks labor over manuscripts, copying texts by hand in the wavering light of candles and oil lamps. The world outside the monastery walls is vast and often dangerous, filled with petty kingdoms constantly at war, with raiders from the sea, with forests that seem to stretch forever. Inside these walls, monks preserve what fragments of learning they can, copying not only scripture and the works of the church fathers but also whatever classical texts have survived. It's in places like this that knowledge about comets is preserved. Monks copy the works of Pliny and other Roman writers. They add to these ancient observations their own records of comets that appear in their time, noting the date, the comet's position in the sky, how long it remained visible, and, crucially, what happened afterward. These chronicle entries are often brief, sometimes just a line or two, but they give us a window into how medieval people experienced these celestial visitors. Here's an example, translated from medieval Latin. In the year of our Lord 530, a comet appeared in the eastern sky, remaining visible for 20 nights. Its tail stretched across a third of the heavens. In that same year, a great plague came upon the land, and many died. Another entry, from a different chronicle: in the year 684, a star with hair was seen in the west during autumn. That winter was unusually severe, and famine followed, for the crops had failed. Notice what these entries do: they link the comet's appearance with subsequent disasters. Over time, as more and more such entries accumulated in chronicles across Europe, a pattern seemed to emerge. Comets preceded bad things. Plague, famine, war, the death of kings, these calamities seemed to follow in the wake of comets. And if you were a medieval person reading these chronicles or hearing them read aloud, this pattern would be convincing. Here was evidence, recorded by learned men, men of the church who surely wouldn't lie, that comets were harbingers of doom. But let's think more deeply about what's happening here. The medieval world was a place of constant uncertainty and frequent catastrophe. Plague was a recurring nightmare, not just the Black Death that would devastate Europe in the 14th century, but countless other epidemics that swept through regions, killing indiscriminately. Famine was a regular occurrence, dependent as people were on local agriculture and vulnerable as they were to any change in weather patterns. A late frost, too much rain, a dry summer, any of these could mean that the harvest failed, and a failed harvest meant starvation. War was endemic, with kingdoms and nobles constantly fighting over territory, succession, or simple plunder. In such a world, disasters weren't exceptional, they were part of the fabric of life. So when a comet appeared, it was almost certain that within the next months or years, something bad would happen, because bad things happened regularly. But the human mind seeks meaning, seeks explanations, and it's much more comforting to believe that disasters have warnings, that there are signs we can read, than to accept that catastrophe can strike without warning or reason. There's something else at work here too, something psychological that helps explain the intensity of medieval comet fear. Comets were unpredictable. Unlike eclipses, which could be calculated in advance by those who knew the techniques, comets appeared without warning. You might go to bed with the sky looking perfectly normal, and wake to find a blazing new object visible overhead. This unpredictability made comets especially unsettling. They represented chaos breaking into order, the unknown intruding into the known world. And they looked threatening. Imagine seeing a comet for the first time, with no understanding of what it actually is. You look up and see something that resembles a sword hanging in the sky, its blade pointing downward toward the earth. Or perhaps it looks like a flaming torch, or a dagger with a long blade trailing behind it. These weren't neutral images. In a world where swords and daggers meant violence and death, where fire meant destruction, these visual associations would have been immediate and powerful. Medieval writers often described comets in explicitly threatening terms. They wrote of fiery swords in the sky, of bearded stars with hostile glances, of celestial signs that threatened the earth below. This language wasn't merely metaphorical, it reflected a genuine sense that these objects posed some kind of danger, that they were weapons or warnings or perhaps both. Let's move forward now to one of the most famous comets in medieval history, one that would become permanently associated with military conquest and political upheaval. The year is 1066, and we're in England, in the spring of that year. King Edward the Confessor has died without a clear heir, and Harold Godwinson has claimed the throne. But his claim is disputed by William, Duke of Normandy, across the Channel in France, who insists that Edward promised him the succession. Tension hangs over England like a gathering storm. Everyone knows that war is coming, that before the year is out, armies will clash and the kingdom's fate will be decided. And then, in April of 1066, a comet appears. It's bright enough to be visible even during the day, and at night its tail stretches across a significant portion of the sky. People throughout England look up and see it, and they remember all those chronicle entries, all those stories about comets preceding disaster. The comet hangs in the sky for weeks, visible night after night, impossible to ignore, and as people see it, they wonder, what doom is this announcing? What catastrophe is coming? We know about this comet not just from written chronicles but from one of the most remarkable historical documents to survive from the Middle Ages, the Bayeux Tapestry. This isn't actually a tapestry at all, but an enormous embroidered cloth, stretching over 200 feet long, that tells the story of the Norman conquest of England in pictures and Latin text. And there, among the scenes of Harold's coronation and William's preparations for invasion, is a depiction of the comet. In the tapestry, the comet blazes over a scene of English courtiers pointing up at the sky in alarm while King Harold sits on his throne, looking troubled. Below the main scene, the tapestry shows ships, foreshadowing the invasion fleet that will soon cross the Channel. The comet's appearance was interpreted differently depending on which side you supported. For the English, it was an omen of doom, a sign that Harold's reign would be troubled and brief. For the Normans, once William had won his victory at the Battle of Hastings in October of that year, it became a sign that heaven approved of his claim, that God himself had announced William's coming triumph. This is fascinating. The same comet, the same celestial event, could be read in completely opposite ways depending on the outcome of earthly events. The comet of 1066 was, of course, what we now call Halley's Comet, which returns to the inner solar system approximately every 76 years. The medieval people who saw it didn't know this. They couldn't have known that the same comet had appeared in 989, and before that in 912, and would appear again in 1145. Each appearance seemed unique, a singular message from heaven rather than a regularly recurring natural phenomenon. Let's pause here and consider more deeply the worldview that made comet fear not just understandable but almost inevitable in the medieval mind. The medieval cosmos was not the infinite, mechanistic universe that we inhabit today. It was smaller, more intimate, and fundamentally purposeful. Earth sat at the center, surrounded by nested spheres that carried the moon, the sun, the planets, and the fixed stars. Beyond the outermost sphere was the dwelling place of God and the angels, sometimes called the empyrean heaven. This cosmic structure wasn't just physical, it was also moral and spiritual. The further from Earth, the more perfect and divine the realm. Earth was the realm of change, corruption, and mortality. The heavens were eternal, perfect, and incorruptible. Everything in this universe had meaning and purpose. Nothing happened by chance. If God had created the stars and set them in their courses, if he had numbered them and called them all by name as the Psalms declared, then surely he could also create unusual celestial phenomena to communicate with humanity. This meant that comets couldn't be dismissed as meaningless. They had to mean something. The question wasn't whether a comet was a sign, but what it was a sign of, and to whom it was addressed. Was it warning of plague? War? The death of a ruler? Was it addressed to a specific kingdom or to all of Christendom? These were the questions that scholars, clerics, and rulers grappled with when a comet appeared. And here's where things become even more interesting. In the medieval world, knowledge wasn't democratized the way it is today. Books were rare and expensive, laboriously copied by hand. Literacy was limited to a small educated elite, clergy, monks, some nobles, and scribes. Most people, even most nobles, couldn't read. They depended on others to interpret written texts for them. So when a comet appeared, ordinary people would turn to those who were supposed to know about such things, the clergy, the learned men who could read Latin and had access to ancient texts about the heavens. Picture a parish priest in a small medieval village being asked about the comet that has appeared in the sky. The peasants who make up his congregation are frightened. They've seen the comet, they've heard rumors and stories, and they want to know what it means. The priest himself may have limited education. Perhaps he can read Latin well enough to conduct the Mass, but his understanding of astronomy is basic at best. He might have heard that comets traditionally precede disasters, information passed down from earlier priests or half remembered from his own training. What does he tell his frightened parishioners? Most likely, he tells them what he believes to be true, that the comet is a warning from God, a call to repentance, a sign that they must examine their consciences and amend their lives before whatever judgment the comet announces arrives. This isn't cynical manipulation. The priest himself probably believes what he's saying. He's working with the knowledge available to him, filtered through centuries of tradition and interpretation. And the response from the congregation? They do what medieval people typically did in the face of divine warnings. They pray, they attend extra masses, they make offerings to the church, perhaps they undertake pilgrimages or other acts of penance. The wealthy might endow a chapel or give alms to the poor. Everyone tries, in their own way, to ward off whatever doom the comet has announced. Now, we must recognize that not everyone in the medieval period believed that comets were supernatural warnings. There was always a strand of thought, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman learning, that sought natural explanations. Even Aristotle's atmospheric theory, while we now know it's wrong, was an attempt at natural explanation rather than supernatural interpretation. And throughout the Middle Ages, there were scholars who tried to understand comets in natural terms. In the Islamic world, which preserved and expanded upon Greek learning while medieval Europe was still struggling to recover it, scholars like al-Battani and Ibn Sina studied comets and tried to explain them without resorting to supernatural causes. Some of this learning eventually made its way to Europe through translations of Arabic texts in places like Toledo and Sicily, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked side by side. By the 12th and 13th centuries, as European learning began to flourish again in the newly founded universities, there was increasing interest in understanding comets through natural philosophy. Scholars debated where comets were located. Were they really in the atmosphere as Aristotle claimed, or might they be in the celestial spheres? They discussed what comets were made of, how they moved, and why they eventually disappeared. These were genuine scientific questions, asked and debated in a spirit of intellectual inquiry. But here's the crucial point: Even among those scholars who sought natural explanations for comets, few doubted that they could also serve as divine signs. This might seem contradictory to us, but it made perfect sense in the medieval worldview. God worked through natural causes. The fact that comets might have a natural explanation didn't mean they couldn't also carry meaning. A comet could be both an atmospheric phenomenon and a warning from God. Natural and supernatural explanations weren't mutually exclusive but complementary. Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the greatest of the medieval theologians, wrote about this very issue in the 13th century. He accepted Aristotle's natural explanation of comets while also maintaining that God could use them to signify coming events. For Aquinas, God was the author of nature, and nature was the language God spoke. Reading the signs in nature, including comets, was thus a way of understanding divine intentions. This sophisticated position allowed for both scientific inquiry and religious interpretation without seeing any contradiction between them. Let's move forward now to consider how comet fear operated at the highest levels of medieval society, among kings and nobles who had the power to shape events. For these rulers, comets posed particular challenges and opportunities. A comet appearing during a reign could be interpreted as a warning about that particular ruler. Perhaps his rule was unjust, perhaps he was destined to die soon, perhaps his dynasty was doomed. But it could also be interpreted as a warning about his enemies, a sign that those who opposed him would soon face divine judgment. Consider the position of a medieval king when a comet appears. He rules by divine right, claiming that God has ordained his kingship. His legitimacy rests on the idea that he's God's appointed agent on earth, at least within his kingdom. But now a comet has appeared, and many interpret it as a sign of divine displeasure. If the king ignores it, he might seem impious, unconcerned with divine messages. But if he takes it too seriously, he might appear weak or superstitious, undermining his own authority. It's a delicate balance. Often, rulers would respond to comets by ordering special prayers, processions, and religious services. This served multiple purposes. It showed that the king took divine warnings seriously and was a pious Christian ruler. It gave the populace something constructive to do with their fear, channeling anxiety into religious ritual. And it allowed the king to appear as an intermediary between his people and God, reinforcing his role as a divinely ordained ruler who cared for his subjects' spiritual welfare. There are numerous recorded instances of such responses. In 1222, when a bright comet appeared over Europe, Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, ordered prayers and processions throughout his domains. In 1264, another comet led to similar orders across multiple kingdoms. These weren't isolated incidents but part of a standard playbook for how rulers were expected to respond to celestial signs. But comets could also be weaponized politically. If a comet appeared during an enemy's reign, that could be used as propaganda, suggesting that God was warning against that ruler or predicting his downfall. This was especially potent during periods of contested succession or civil war, when multiple claimants to a throne might all try to interpret the same comet in ways that supported their own cause. The comet of 1066 that we discussed earlier is a perfect example. Before the Battle of Hastings, Harold's supporters might have seen it as a test from God, a trial that their rightful king would overcome. After Harold's defeat and death, William's supporters could point to the comet as having predicted exactly what came to pass, that Harold's reign was doomed from the start. The comet's meaning was constructed retroactively, its significance determined by the outcome of events rather than being intrinsically clear. Now, let's descend from the halls of kings and return to ordinary people, to the peasants who made up the vast majority of the medieval population. For them, comet fear was immediate and visceral in ways that had everything to do with the precariousness of their existence. A peasant farmer lived always on the edge of subsistence. A single bad harvest could mean starvation. An epidemic could wipe out entire families. Raiders or soldiers could burn crops and villages. In such a world, any sign of impending disaster would be terrifying. Imagine you're a peasant in a medieval village, perhaps somewhere in France in the 13th century. Your entire world is small: the village where you live, the lord's manor where you owe labor service, the fields you work, the forest where you gather firewood and forage for mushrooms, the church where you worship. Most of your neighbors are people you've known your entire life, many of them relatives. The rhythm of your year is determined by agricultural seasons: plowing, planting, tending, harvesting, the endless cycle that keeps you and your family fed, if you're lucky. Now a comet has appeared in the sky. You've never seen anything like it before, this strange light with its ghostly tail. The priest has told you it's a warning from God, that disasters are coming. What do? You can't leave, you're bound to the land, tied to your lord's estate by feudal obligations. You can't store up supplies against future famine, you barely have enough for this year. You can't protect yourself against plague. Medieval medicine has no real defense against epidemic disease. All you can do is pray, and work, and hope that whatever doom the comet has announced will pass you by. And when disaster does come, whether it's a harsh winter, a failed harvest, an epidemic, or an army passing through and taking your grain as provisions, you remember the comet. The connection is made. The comet warned, and disaster followed. This confirmation strengthens your belief in comets as harbingers of doom, and when another comet appears years or decades later, you'll fear it all the more because you remember what happened last time. This is how comet fear perpetuated itself through generations. Each comet that was followed by disaster reinforced the belief that comets predicted disasters. And since disasters were common enough in medieval life, it was rare for a comet not to be followed eventually by something that could be interpreted as the fulfillment of its warning. There's another dimension to medieval comet fear that we need to explore: its connection to apocalyptic expectations. Christianity is, in many ways, an apocalyptic religion. The New Testament speaks of the end times, of Christ's return, of the final judgment when the living and the dead will be judged and the world as we know it will end. These weren't abstract theological concepts for medieval people, they were vivid, real possibilities that could occur at any time. Various signs were supposed to precede the end of the world. The book of Revelation speaks of stars falling from heaven, of the sun being darkened and the moon turning to blood. Other apocalyptic texts, popular in the Middle Ages even if not officially part of the Bible, elaborated on these signs. Comets could be interpreted as fulfilling some of these prophecies, suggesting that the end times were approaching. This apocalyptic framework meant that comet fear wasn't just about immediate, localized disasters, it could be about the ultimate disaster, the end of the world itself. When a particularly bright or unusual comet appeared, some preachers and prophets would declare that this was it, that the end times had begun, that Christ's return was imminent. Most of the time, these predictions would prove false, but that didn't stop new predictions when the next comet appeared. There's a fascinating psychological phenomenon at work here. When prophecies of doom don't come to pass, you might expect people to lose faith in the predictions. Sometimes that happens, but often the opposite occurs. Failed predictions are reinterpreted. Perhaps the time frame was wrong, perhaps the disaster was averted by collective prayer and penance, perhaps the sign meant something slightly different than was first thought. This process of reinterpretation allows the basic belief system to survive even when specific predictions fail. Let's consider now the role of astrology in medieval comet fear. We mentioned earlier that church authorities officially condemned astrology, the idea that the stars could determine human fate. But the actual situation was more complicated than an outright ban. Throughout the Middle Ages, astrology was widely practiced, even by clergy and scholars. The key distinction was between what was called judicial astrology, using the stars to predict specific individual fates, which was condemned, and natural astrology, which studied the influence of celestial bodies on weather, health, and general earthly conditions, which was considered acceptable and even part of natural philosophy. Comets occupied an ambiguous position in this system. They weren't part of the regular celestial order that astrologers mapped and interpreted. They appeared unexpectedly, disrupting the usual patterns. Some astrologers tried to incorporate comets into their predictions, claiming to be able to read their meaning through various techniques, analyzing which constellation they appeared in, what direction their tail pointed, what color they were, how long they remained visible. These interpretations were complex and often contradictory, different astrologers reading the same comet in different ways. But the existence of astrological interpretation, even if criticized by church authorities, meant that there was a ready-made framework for understanding comets as meaningful signs. Even people who wouldn't consult an astrologer about their personal horoscope might accept that a comet could have astrological significance, indicating coming changes in kingdoms, the death of rulers, wars between nations, or widespread calamities. One of the most influential texts on comets in the later Middle Ages was written by an Italian scholar named Albertus Magnus in the 13th century. Albert was a Dominican friar, a bishop, and one of the most learned men of his age, with interests spanning theology, philosophy, and natural science. In his work on meteors, remember, Aristotle had classified comets as meteors, atmospheric phenomena. Albert tried to synthesize ancient learning with Christian theology and his own observations. Albert accepted the basic Aristotelian view that comets were atmospheric, formed from exhalations of the earth that caught fire in the upper air. But he also cataloged different types of comets and tried to associate them with different kinds of predictions. A comet appearing in a particular constellation might indicate coming war, while one of a different color or shape might suggest plague or famine. This kind of systematization gave scholars and rulers a framework for interpreting comets, even if that framework was based on incorrect assumptions about what comets actually were. As we move into the 14th and 15th centuries, comet fear intensified in some ways because this period saw such tremendous catastrophes that seemed to confirm the worst predictions. The 14th century brought the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in European history, which killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's population in just a few years. It brought the 100 Years' War between England and France. It brought the Avignon papacy and the Western Schism, when multiple men claimed to be the true pope. It brought peasant rebellions and economic upheavals. And yes, there were comets during this period too. When a comet appeared in 1337, shortly before the outbreak of the 100 Years' War, people remembered it as having predicted the terrible conflict. When another comet appeared in 1402, during a period of particularly vicious warfare and political chaos, it seemed to confirm that the world was spiraling towards some ultimate catastrophe. But something else was beginning to happen in this period. The late Middle Ages saw the beginnings of what we might call proto-scientific observation of comets. More careful records were being kept, not just noting that a comet appeared and what disaster followed, but describing the comet itself in detail, its position, brightness, the shape and length of its tail, its movement against the background stars over time. These observations were still interpreted within a framework of divine signs and astrological influence, but they represented a shift toward empirical study. One figure who bridges the medieval and early modern periods is the German mathematician and astronomer Regiomontanus, working in the mid-15th century. Regiomontanus observed comets carefully and tried to determine whether they were atmospheric phenomena as Aristotle claimed or whether they might actually be in the celestial spheres. His observations and calculations suggested that comets were farther away than the moon, placing them in what should be the unchanging celestial realm. This was a challenge to Aristotelian cosmology, though Regiomontanus himself didn't fully develop the implications of his work. It's worth noting that the 15th century also saw the development of the printing press, which would eventually transform how knowledge about comets and everything else was shared. Instead of manuscripts laboriously copied by hand, texts could now be printed in hundreds or thousands of copies. This meant that when a comet appeared, observations, predictions, and interpretations could spread more quickly and widely than ever before. In some ways, this amplified comet fear. More people could read more predictions of doom. But it also meant that contradictory interpretations were available, and readers could compare different accounts and start to think critically about which were most credible. Let's shift our perspective now and consider how comet fear might have looked from outside Christendom. The Islamic world had its own traditions regarding comets, drawing on ancient Greek learning but also on Quranic interpretation and Islamic theology. Muslim astronomers, some of the most sophisticated in the medieval world, observed comets and recorded them. But the interpretation of comets as omens operated differently in Islamic culture than in Christian Europe. In Islamic tradition, while comets were acknowledged as potentially significant signs, there was also a strong emphasis on divine sovereignty and the idea that only God knows the future. The Quran explicitly states that knowledge of the unseen belongs to God alone. This theological position made systematic omen interpretation, including reading the future from comets, theologically problematic in ways that weren't quite the same in Christian Europe. That said, in practice, many people in the Islamic world did interpret comets as omens, just as their Christian contemporaries did. Chronicles from Islamic historians record comets and the disasters that followed them in much the same way that European chronicles do. The human desire to find meaning in unusual phenomena transcends religious and cultural boundaries. In the Jewish communities of medieval Europe, comet interpretation was influenced both by biblical tradition and by the surrounding Christian and Islamic cultures. The Hebrew Bible contains relatively few references to celestial signs, but later Jewish texts, particularly in the mystical tradition of Kabbalah, developed complex systems of interpreting cosmic phenomena. Medieval Jewish scholars like Maimonides took positions similar to Thomas Aquinas, acknowledging that comets existed and could be studied naturally while maintaining that God could use them for divine purposes. Let's return to Europe and move forward to the cusp of what we call the early modern period, the late 15th and early 16th centuries. This is a time of tremendous change. The Renaissance is in full swing, bringing renewed interest in classical learning and new approaches to art, literature, and science. The Protestant Reformation is about to split Western Christianity. European explorers are sailing to the Americas and around Africa to Asia, expanding the known world dramatically. And within this context of change, attitudes toward comets are beginning to shift as well, though traditional fears remain deeply embedded. Picture the year 1531, and imagine standing in the streets of a German city, perhaps Nuremberg or Augsburg, one of those prosperous trading centers where new ideas circulate as freely as the goods that flow through their markets. The city is bustling with activity, merchants haggling over prices of cloth and spices, artisans working in their shops, scholars debating in Latin while burghers discuss politics in the local dialect. Printing presses are clacking away, producing not just religious texts but also pamphlets, broadsheets, and books on every conceivable subject. And then, one evening, word spreads that a comet has been sighted. Within days, the printing presses are producing broadsheets about it. Some are written by astronomers, describing the comet's position and movement. Others are by astrologers, offering predictions about what it means. Still others are by preachers, interpreting it as a divine warning and calling for repentance. An artist creates a woodcut illustration showing the comet blazing over a city, with people pointing up in alarm. This image is printed on hundreds of broadsheets and distributed throughout the German-speaking lands. The comet of 1531 was, like the comet of 1066, what we now call Halley's Comet on another of its regular returns. But to the people observing it, it was a unique and troubling phenomenon. Europe was in turmoil. The Protestant Reformation had split Christianity, leading to religious wars and bitter theological disputes. The Ottoman Empire was threatening Vienna, with Turkish armies pushing deep into Christian Europe. Plague and warfare were constant companions. In this context, a comet seemed to many people like a divine comment on the chaos of the age, a warning that worse was yet to come. But not everyone interpreted the comet in traditional terms. There were scholars beginning to ask different questions, not just what does this comet mean, but what is a comet? Where is it located in space? What is it made of? How does it move? These questions reflected a shifting approach to understanding the natural world, one that prioritized observation and measurement over inherited authority. The shift we're witnessing here is gradual, not sudden. It's not that medieval people suddenly became modern and stopped fearing comets. Rather, alongside the traditional fear and religious interpretation, there emerged increasingly sophisticated attempts to understand comets as natural phenomena that could be studied using the tools of mathematics and careful observation. These two approaches, traditional omen interpretation and emerging scientific inquiry, coexisted for a long time, often within the same person. A scholar might carefully measure a comet's position and calculate its distance while also believing that it foretold war or plague. Let's pause here and reflect on what we've uncovered about medieval comet fear. It wasn't a simple or monolithic thing. It emerged from multiple sources: ancient learning that had been preserved and transmitted through centuries, biblical and theological interpretation that saw divine communication in unusual phenomena, astrological frameworks that assigned meaning to celestial events, folk beliefs rooted in the observation that bad things often followed comets, and political uses of comet interpretation by rulers and their opponents. Medieval people feared comets because comets represented the intrusion of the unexpected into an ordered cosmos, because they seemed to carry messages that needed to be deciphered, because they appeared to predict disasters that actually occurred with depressing regularity in a world of plague, famine, and war, and because the visual appearance of comets, those swords and daggers and flaming torches in the sky, was inherently threatening to people who lived with violence as a constant possibility. But comet fear was also more subtle than mere terror. It was a way of making sense of a world that often seemed senseless, a way of asserting that there was meaning and pattern even in catastrophe, that disasters were not random but announced in advance by a divine intelligence that cared enough about humanity to send warnings. In a strange way, comet fear was almost comforting. It suggested that the universe was not indifferent to human affairs, that there was someone watching, someone communicating, even if the messages were often dire. Think about this for a moment. If you lived in a world where plague could arrive without warning and kill half your village in a month, where armies could appear and destroy everything you'd built, where a single bad harvest could mean starvation, wouldn't there be some comfort in believing that such disasters were preceded by signs? At least then you'd have warning, time to prepare spiritually if not materially, a chance to make peace with God before the calamity struck. This is part of why comet fear persisted so long and why it was so resistant to purely rational arguments against it. It fulfilled psychological and spiritual needs that cold natural philosophy couldn't address. Telling someone that a comet was just a ball of ice and rock in space, with no more meaning than a distant mountain, would have felt like being told that suffering was meaningless, that death was random, that there was no overarching narrative to human existence. For many people, that was a more frightening prospect than believing comets were divine warnings. Let's explore now some specific comet appearances and how they were experienced, moving through the medieval period chronologically to get a sense of how these events unfolded in real time. We've already discussed the famous comet of 1066, but there were many others, each with its own story. In the year 1264, a bright comet appeared during the summer months, visible for several weeks. This was a period of significant political instability in England, where King Henry III was engaged in a struggle with his barons led by Simon de Montfort. The kingdom was sliding towards civil war. When the comet appeared, both sides interpreted it as a sign supporting their cause. The king's supporters suggested it warned of the evil of rebellion against divinely ordained authority. The barons' party claimed it indicated God's displeasure with Henry's tyrannical rule. Within a year, the Battle of Lewes was fought, where Henry was captured by the barons. Those who had predicted disaster could point to this as the comet's fulfillment, though different factions would disagree about whether the disaster was the king's capture or the success of rebellion. Moving forward to 1301, another notable comet appeared, this one recorded by chroniclers across Europe. The early 14th century was a time of population growth and economic expansion, but also increasing tension. The climate was beginning to shift toward what historians call the Little Ice Age, though people at the time couldn't know this. The comet of 1301 was later remembered as having preceded a series of particularly harsh winters and poor harvests in the 1310s, culminating in the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when crop failures across northern Europe led to widespread starvation. Looking back from the desperate years of famine, people remembered the comet and saw it as having warned of what was coming. Chronicles written after the famine sometimes inserted or emphasized mentions of the comet, fitting it into a narrative where divine warning preceded divine punishment. This is an important point about how comet fear worked. Memory was selective and retrospective. After a disaster, people remembered and emphasized whatever unusual signs had preceded it, while signs that weren't followed by disasters were more likely to be forgotten or deemed less significant. The comet of 1337, appearing just as the Hundred Years' War was beginning, was widely reported and feared. By this point, the tradition of comet watching was well established. When a comet appeared, educated people knew to check the chronicles to see what had happened after previous comets. The pattern seemed clear and ominous. Comets meant war, plague, or famine, often all three. The appearance of a bright comet in 1337 seemed to announce the beginning of a conflict that would indeed drag on for over a century, devastating France and draining England. But here's something interesting: the comet didn't actually cause the war or even predict it with any specificity. The political tensions that led to the Hundred Years' War had been building for decades. Edward III of England had a claim to the French throne, and Philip VI of France had his own claim. Their kingdoms had overlapping territories and conflicting interests. War was probably inevitable regardless of celestial signs. But the comet provided a framework for understanding what was happening, a way of seeing the war as part of a divine plan rather than just human ambition and political calculation. The most famous comet of the medieval period, at least in terms of its association with catastrophe, appeared in 1402. This comet was particularly bright and visible for an extended period. It appeared during one of the darkest times in late medieval history. Europe was still recovering from the Black Death, which had first struck in 1347 to 1351 and returned in waves. The Hundred Years' War was still raging, the Church was divided in the Western Schism with rival popes, and the Ottoman Turks were expanding into Christian territory in the Balkans. The comet of 1402 was interpreted by many as a sign that the end times were approaching. Apocalyptic preachers used it to call for repentance, declaring that the Last Judgment was imminent. Interestingly, in the Islamic world, the same comet was observed and also generated concern, appearing just before the Battle of Ankara in 1402, where the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I was defeated and captured by Timur, the Mongol conqueror. Both Christian and Muslim chroniclers recorded the comet and linked it to this significant battle, showing how comet interpretation transcended religious boundaries. Let's consider now the physical experience of seeing a comet in the medieval period. We're so used to light pollution today that we forget what the night sky looks like when it's truly dark. In the medieval world, there were no electric lights, no cars with headlights, no glowing cities. When the sun set, the world became genuinely dark, broken only by fire, hearth fires, candles, torches, oil lamps. On a clear night in the countryside, away from even the modest light of a village, the sky would have been magnificent in a way that most people today never experience. The Milky Way would stretch across the sky like a river of light. Thousands of stars would be visible, far more than we can see from even the darkest modern locations. The planets would shine like bright jewels. And into this familiar sky, a comet would arrive like an intruder. Imagine seeing it for the first time. You've gone outside in the evening, perhaps to check on livestock or simply to enjoy the cool air after a hot day. You look up at the stars, as familiar to you as the face of your spouse, the layout of your village. You know the constellations, not by their classical Greek names, necessarily, but by whatever your local tradition calls them. You use them to tell time, to know which season is approaching, to navigate at night if you must travel. And then you notice it, something that shouldn't be there. At first, you might think it's a cloud, but it doesn't move like clouds move. It's a fuzzy patch of light where no star should be, and extending from it is a faint glow, like a tail or a beam. Over the following nights, it grows brighter. The tail becomes more pronounced. The comet moves slowly against the background of fixed stars, making its way across constellations. Night after night, it's there, this visitor from nowhere, this sign that something is wrong with the cosmic order. You would feel it in your gut, a sense of wrongness, of threat. Even if you didn't know all the lore about comets predicting disaster, you would know that this was unusual, and in a world where unusual often meant dangerous, you would be afraid. When you went to church on Sunday, you would listen carefully to what the priest said about it. When you gathered with neighbors to work in the fields or share a meal, conversation would turn to the comet. What does it mean? What have people heard? What do the old-timers remember about the last time a comet appeared? Stories would circulate. Someone's grandfather remembered a comet from decades ago, and what disaster followed it. A traveler from a distant town brought news that a learned monk had interpreted this comet as predicting war. A merchant who could read had seen a printed broadsheet claiming the comet announced the end of the world. These stories would mix with your own observations, your own fears, creating a rich tapestry of anxiety and speculation. And then something bad would happen. Perhaps not immediately, comets could remain visible for weeks or months, and the disasters they supposedly predicted might not arrive for months or even years after. But eventually, something bad would happen, because bad things happened regularly in the medieval world. A child would die of fever. The harvest would be poor. Raiders would attack a neighboring village. The Lord would increase taxes to pay for a war. And when that bad thing happened, you would remember the comet, and the connection would be made, reinforced, incorporated into your understanding of how the world works. This is how comet fear was maintained at the individual level, through personal experience and communal memory, through stories told and retold, through the basic human need to find patterns and meaning in a chaotic world. Let's turn now to a different aspect of comet fear, its role in medieval art and literature. Comets appear frequently in medieval manuscripts, often as illustrations in chronicles or astronomical texts. These illustrations are fascinating because they show us how medieval artists conceptualized comets. Sometimes they're depicted quite naturalistically, as a star-like object with a streaming tail. Other times they're more stylized or symbolic, shown as swords, spears, or flaming torches hanging in the sky above worried people or scenes of disaster. One particularly striking image appears in the Nuremberg Chronicle, a printed book from 1493 that attempted to compile world history from creation to the present. The chronicle includes several illustrations of comets, showing them above cities or appearing among stars. The artistic style emphasizes their threatening nature, their sharp, angular, aggressive-looking objects that dominate the images they appear in. In medieval literature, comets often appear at crucial moments in narratives, serving as omens of coming plot developments. A chronicle might describe a comet appearing before the death of a king, reinforcing the idea that even secular history was guided by divine providence and announced through celestial signs. Epic poems and romances might include comets as atmospheric details, setting the mood for tragic events to come. The role of comets in medieval culture was thus not limited to astronomy or even theology. They permeated the imaginative life of the period, appearing in art, literature, and even in popular culture. Comet imagery was used in heraldry, appeared in the decorations of churches and manuscripts, and became part of the visual vocabulary through which medieval people understood their world. There's a particular kind of literature that flourished in the later Middle Ages called prognostications, texts that attempted to predict future events based on various signs, including comets. These prognostications were immensely popular, especially after the advent of printing made them widely available. When a comet appeared, astrologers and other learned men would rush to publish prognostications interpreting what it meant. These texts would be read eagerly by anyone who could read or could find someone to read to them. The prognostications varied widely in their specific predictions, but they shared certain common themes. They almost always predicted some kind of disruption, war, plague, famine, the death of rulers, political upheaval. They rarely, if ever, predicted good outcomes. This negative bias wasn't because medieval prognosticators were pessimistic by nature, but because of the underlying logic of comet interpretation. Comets were anomalies, disruptions of the natural order. It made sense within their framework that comets would announce disruptive events rather than peaceful continuity. Some prognostications were quite sophisticated, attempting to derive specific predictions from detailed analysis of the comet's characteristics. They would consider which constellation the comet appeared in and what that constellation governed according to astrological theory. They would analyze the color of the comet. Red supposedly indicated war and bloodshed, pale or white suggested disease, dark colors meant famine. The direction of the tail was significant. A tail pointing toward a particular kingdom or city suggested that place would be especially affected by whatever the comet foretold. Other prognostications were vaguer, offering general warnings about coming troubles without specifying exactly what would happen or when. This vagueness was actually quite clever, because it made the predictions almost impossible to falsify. If something bad happened in the months or years after a comet appeared, the prognostication could be seen as correct. If nothing particularly dramatic occurred, it could be argued that the disaster was averted through prayer and divine mercy, or that the prognostication's time frame was simply longer than expected. Now, let's consider the economic aspects of comet fear. We don't often think about the economics of fear, but in the medieval world, comet appearances had real economic consequences. When a comet appeared and was interpreted as predicting disaster, people would change their behavior in ways that affected markets and trade. If a comet was thought to predict famine, people with resources might try to stockpile grain, driving up prices and actually creating food shortages before any real famine occurred. If war was predicted, merchants might avoid certain trade routes, nobles might spend money preparing their defenses, and peasants might try to hide or bury valuables in anticipation of armies passing through. If plague was feared, people might avoid traveling or gathering in markets, disrupting normal commercial activity. The church, too, benefited economically from comet fear. When comets appeared, donations to churches and monasteries often increased as people sought to secure divine favor through charitable giving. Offerings for masses, payments for prayers, endowments for chapels, all of these might spike when a comet appeared and people feared for their souls in the face of coming judgment. This isn't to suggest that medieval people's fear was cynical or that religious institutions deliberately exploited comet appearances for profit. Rather, it shows how deeply interwoven religious belief, economic behavior, and social practice were in medieval society. Fear of comets wasn't just a matter of private belief, it shaped public behavior in ways that had real, measurable effects on how medieval society functioned. Let's shift our attention now to a fascinating development in the 15th century, the beginning of systematic, coordinated comet observation. As astronomical instruments improved and communication networks expanded, it became possible for observers in different locations to record the same comet and compare their observations. This led to some interesting discoveries. One of the most important was the realization that comets were genuinely distant objects, not atmospheric phenomena close to the Earth. If a comet were in the atmosphere, Observers at different locations should see it at significantly different positions against the background stars, just as you see nearby objects shift position when you look at them with first one eye and then the other. This shift is called parallax, and astronomers knew how to measure it. When careful observations from different locations showed little or no parallax for comets, it suggested they must be very far away, farther than the Moon at least. This was a problem for the Aristotelian cosmology that placed comets in the upper atmosphere. If comets were beyond the Moon, they were in what should be the perfect, unchanging celestial spheres. But comets clearly changed. They appeared, grew brighter, faded, and disappeared. How could this be reconciled with the idea of celestial perfection? This question became increasingly urgent as more and more observations accumulated. The 15th century astronomer Regiomontanus, whom we mentioned earlier, made careful observations of comets and calculated that they must be in the celestial sphere, challenging Aristotelian doctrine. But Regiomontanus died young, and his work on comets wasn't fully developed or published until after his death. It would take until the 16th century, and particularly the work of the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe, for the celestial nature of comets to be definitively established. Tycho's observations of the Great Comet of 1577 proved beyond doubt that comets moved through the supposedly solid crystalline spheres that were thought to carry the planets. This had profound implications for cosmology, implications that would eventually contribute to the overthrow of the entire geocentric model of the universe. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, moving beyond the medieval period into the early modern era. For our purposes, what's important is that by the end of the Middle Ages, there were increasing tensions between inherited theories about comets and careful empirical observation. These tensions wouldn't be resolved within the medieval framework. They required new ways of thinking about the cosmos, new cosmological models, new mathematical tools. Yet even as the scientific understanding of comets was beginning to change, the fear remained. Tycho Brahe himself, one of the greatest observational astronomers of his age, still believed that comets were divine portents, even as he proved they weren't atmospheric phenomena. The great astronomer Johannes Kepler, working in the early 17th century and discovering the laws of planetary motion that would help Isaac Newton develop his theory of gravitation, also believed comets carried meaning and could influence earthly events. The point here is that the transition from medieval to modern thinking wasn't simple or sudden. It was gradual, uneven, and full of contradictions. People could accept new observational evidence while maintaining old interpretive frameworks. They could use the latest mathematical techniques while still believing in celestial omens. The human mind is remarkably good at holding contradictory ideas simultaneously, especially when those ideas serve different purposes, one explaining how things work, the other explaining what they mean. Let's return once more to the lived experience of comet fear, but this time from a different social perspective. We've talked about peasants and kings, but what about someone in between, perhaps a merchant, a guild member, someone who lives in a city and has some education, some wealth, some ability to shape their own circumstances? Imagine you're a cloth merchant in a Flemish city in the year 1456. Another comet has appeared, once again, Halley's Comet on its regular return, though you don't know it returns regularly. You're literate, you can read and write in both your local vernacular and in Latin. You've traveled extensively for your business, visiting trade fairs, negotiating with suppliers and customers, dealing with people from different regions and cultures. You're not a scholar, but you're not ignorant either. You've read some books, heard sermons from learned preachers, discussed current events with other educated townspeople. When the comet appears, you have access to multiple sources of information about it. You can read the prognostications that are circulating in manuscript and printed form. You can hear what the local clergy say about it. You can discuss it with fellow guild members, some of whom might have their own interpretations. You might even know someone who has some astronomical training and can explain the technical details of what's being observed. So what do you make of it? You're probably too sophisticated to believe the most extreme predictions, that the world is about to end, for instance. You've heard that prediction before, and the world is still here. But you take the comet seriously. Historical records show that comets precede troubles, and you've lived through enough troubles yourself to know their real possibilities. The Ottoman Turks are a growing threat to Christian Europe. Political instability affects trade. Plague returns periodically. A comet warning of such troubles seems entirely credible. Your response might be a mixture of practical and spiritual actions. Spiritually, you might increase your charitable giving, attend church more regularly, perhaps even undertake a pilgrimage if you can spare the time. Practically, you might adjust your business practices, perhaps avoid certain trade routes that seem especially risky, diversify your investments, settle debts so that if something happens to you, your affairs will be in order. You're hedging your bets, in other words. You don't know for certain that the comet means disaster is coming, but you're not willing to ignore the possibility either. This is rational behavior given your knowledge and circumstances. You're working with the best information available to you and acting in ways that seem prudent given the uncertainty you face. This middle-class urban perspective on comet fear is important because it shows that comet fear wasn't just about ignorance or blind superstition. Educated, intelligent people took comets seriously because within their framework of understanding the world, comets as warning signs made sense. They fit into a coherent worldview that incorporated elements of natural philosophy, theology, history, and personal experience. As we approach the end of the medieval period and the beginning of what we call the early modern era, roughly the late 15th and early 16th centuries, we can see comet fear beginning to change in character, though not disappearing. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in 1517, would add new dimensions to how comets were interpreted. Protestant reformers often used comet appearances to support their criticisms of the Catholic Church, suggesting that comets were divine warnings about the corruption of the papacy and the need for religious reform. Catholic authorities, conversely, might interpret comets as warnings about the danger of heresy and the division of Christendom. The same comet could thus be interpreted in completely contradictory ways depending on one's religious allegiance. This political and religious weaponization of comet interpretation would continue through the 16th and 17th centuries, during the wars of religion that tore Europe apart. Each side would claim that comets vindicated their position and condemned their opponents. At the same time, the scientific revolution was beginning to gather momentum. Copernicus published his heliocentric theory in 1543, placing the sun rather than the Earth at the center of the cosmos. This didn't immediately affect understanding of comets. Copernicus barely mentioned them, but it started a process of rethinking the basic structure of the universe that would eventually transform how comets were understood. Galileo's use of the telescope, beginning in 1609, opened up new ways of observing celestial phenomena. Though Galileo himself didn't make significant observations of comets, his demonstration that the heavens contained phenomena invisible to the naked eye, the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, the mountains on the moon, challenged the idea that everything important in the sky was obvious and visible. If there were entire worlds of phenomena that required instruments to detect, perhaps comets too were more complex than they appeared. Isaac Newton's work on gravitation and planetary motion, published in 1687, would eventually provide the theoretical framework for understanding that comets were natural objects following predictable paths through space, governed by the same laws of motion and gravitation that controlled the planets. Newton's friend Edmund Halley would use these theories to predict that the comet seen in 1682 would return in 1758, and when it did return as predicted, what we now call Halley's Comet, it was powerful evidence that comets were natural, predictable phenomena rather than divine omens. But even Newton and Halley, living in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, well after the medieval period, were not entirely free of comet fear. Newton speculated that comets might be the mechanism by which God periodically intervened in the natural world to adjust the planetary system or even to destroy and recreate the Earth. Halley, despite calculating comet orbits and predicting their returns, couldn't entirely shake the feeling that comets might pose real physical dangers to the Earth, might even cause catastrophes through collision or near collision. This brings us to an interesting realization. The fear of comets didn't simply end with the Middle Ages. It transformed, evolved, took on new forms, but elements of it persisted for centuries after. Even today, when we understand what comets are and can predict their appearances with extraordinary precision, there's still something unsettling about them. When a particularly bright comet appears, people still feel a stirring of that ancient unease, still half joke about what it might mean, still feel a shiver when they look up and see that strange visitor hanging in the night sky. This persistence suggests that comet fear taps into something deep in human psychology, a fear of the unexpected, a discomfort with things that don't fit into familiar patterns, perhaps even an ancestral memory from times when celestial events really might have presaged danger, when climate changes signaled by astronomical phenomena could mean the difference between survival and extinction for early human populations. But we should be careful not to reduce medieval comet fear to simple psychology or evolutionary programming. It was also a cultural construction, shaped by specific historical circumstances, by the transmission of texts and ideas across generations, by the social and political uses to which comet interpretation was put, by the theological frameworks within which medieval people understood their relationship to the divine. Let's take a moment to summarize what we've learned about why people feared comets in the Middle Ages. First, they inherited from the classical world a tradition of seeing comets as significant, as omens of coming events, particularly disasters. This tradition was preserved in texts that were copied and transmitted through the medieval period, giving comet fear the weight of ancient authority. Second, Christian theology provided a framework for understanding comets as potentially divine communications. In a universe created and governed by God, unusual celestial phenomena could be signs from the Creator to his creatures, warnings to repent, announcements of coming judgment. This wasn't irrational superstition but a logical extension of a belief system that saw the entire cosmos as meaningful and purposeful. Third, the accumulated historical records seem to confirm that comets preceded disasters. Chronicles recorded comet after comet followed by plague, famine, war, or the deaths of rulers. This pattern was real enough. Disasters were common in the medieval world, so any comet was likely to be followed eventually by something that could be interpreted as its fulfillment. Fourth, comets looked threatening. Their appearance, like swords or daggers or flames, carried visual associations with violence and destruction that would have been immediate and powerful to people for whom such violence was a constant threat. Fifth, the unpredictability of comets made them especially unsettling. Unlike eclipses or planetary movements, which followed patterns that could be calculated, comets appeared without warning, stayed for unpredictable lengths of time, and then vanished. This unpredictability suggested caprice, chaos, a breakdown of the normal order. Sixth, comet fear served social and political functions. It could be used by rulers to justify their actions, by preachers to call for repentance and increase religious fervor, by political factions to undermine their opponents. The interpretation of comets was never purely objective but was always shaped by the interests and agendas of those doing the interpreting. And seventh, perhaps most fundamentally, comet fear addressed deep human needs, the need to find meaning in suffering, the need to believe that disaster can be anticipated and perhaps averted, the need to feel that someone or something is in control even when events seem chaotic, the need to believe that the universe is not indifferent to human fate. Understanding these multiple layers of comet fear helps us see medieval people not as superstitious primitives but as thoughtful individuals trying to make sense of their world using the tools and frameworks available to them. They were rational within their own context, even when that rationality led them to conclusions we now know to be incorrect. It's worth reflecting on our own certainties and whether future generations might look back at some of our beliefs with similar puzzlement. We have our own fears and anxieties, our own ways of reading meaning into events, our own tendency to see patterns where perhaps none exist. The difference is not that we're rational and medieval people weren't, but that we have different knowledge, different tools, different frameworks for understanding the world. The night sky that medieval people looked at is the same sky we see today, at least in its fundamental nature. The stars are the same, the planets follow the same paths, comets appear and disappear according to the same physical laws. What has changed is not the sky itself but our understanding of it, the stories we tell about it, the meanings we derive from it. And yet, something has also been lost. Medieval people lived in a cosmos that spoke to them, that communicated, that was full of meaning and purpose. When they looked up at a comet, they saw not just a physical object but a message, a connection between heaven and earth, between the divine and the human. Our modern understanding of comets as icy bodies following gravitational paths is more accurate, but it's also more sterile, more disconnected from human meaning and purpose. There's a poignancy in this loss, a sense that in gaining objective knowledge, we've lost a kind of intimacy with the cosmos. Medieval people were frightened by comets, yes, but they were also engaged with them, interpreting them, finding meaning in them, incorporating them into their understanding of their place in the universe. We observe comets with instruments and calculate their orbits with computers, but do we feel the same sense of connection, the same sense that the cosmos and humanity are part of a single, meaningful story? This isn't to romanticize medieval comet fear or to suggest we should return to it. The fear was real and often debilitating. The disasters that comets supposedly predicted were real and caused immense suffering. The uncertainty and anxiety that comet appearances generated was not a positive thing. But there's something to be learned from taking medieval comet fear seriously, from understanding it as a window into a different way of experiencing and understanding the world. As we near the end of our journey through medieval comet fear, let's return once more to that village we visited at the beginning, but this time imagine it in the late 15th century, on the cusp of profound changes that will transform the medieval world into the early modern world. The comet that appeared in 1456 has long since faded, but its memory remains. Old people in the village can still remember seeing it, remember the fear it generated, remember what came after. The village itself has changed over the generations. Some families have died out, others have prospered. The church has been expanded, its walls decorated with paintings showing biblical scenes and images of saints. The village has survived plague, war, bad harvests, and good ones. Life continues, as it always has, in its cycle of seasons and generations. But things are changing in ways that aren't immediately visible in a small village. In distant cities, printing presses are multiplying knowledge. Explorers are sailing to continents the ancients never knew existed. Artists are developing new techniques, creating images of startling realism and beauty. Scholars are rediscovering ancient texts and asking new questions. Religious reformers are challenging the authority of the church. The medieval world is slowly giving way to something new. When the next bright comet appears, and one will, as comets always do, it will be observed by people who have access to printed books, who may have heard about distant lands and strange peoples, who are beginning to ask different kinds of questions about the world around them. The fear will still be there, but it will be mixed now with curiosity, with systematic observation, with the beginnings of a new approach to understanding nature. The transition from medieval to modern is not a single moment but a process, and comet fear is part of that process. As people slowly come to understand comets as natural objects governed by physical laws, as they accumulate observations and develop theories, as they learn to predict comet returns and calculate their orbits, the fear gradually transforms. It doesn't disappear, but it changes character, becoming less about divine judgment and more about physical danger, less about spiritual meaning and more about scientific understanding. And perhaps, in our own time, we're still in the midst of that transformation, still working out what comets mean to us, what place they have in our understanding of the cosmos and our place within it. We know what they are, icy bodies from the outer solar system, remnants of the formation of the planets, bearing in their composition clues to the early history of our world. We can calculate their orbits with extraordinary precision, predict their appearances decades or centuries in advance, even send spacecraft to visit them and return samples to Earth. But when a bright comet does appear, visible to the naked eye, stretching its tail across a significant portion of the sky, we still feel something, awe, perhaps, or wonder, or just a touch of that ancient unease. We still gather to observe it, still take photographs, still feel compelled to mark its passage in some way. The fear has gone, or mostly gone, but the sense that comets are special, that they mean something, that they connect us to something larger than ourselves, that remains. Perhaps this is the true legacy of medieval comet fear, not the specific beliefs about divine judgment or astrological influence, but the deeper sense that the cosmos and humanity are connected, that what happens in the heavens matters, that we are part of a larger story. Medieval people expressed this sense through their fear and their religious interpretations. We express it differently, through scientific observation and exploration, through the excitement of discovery and the wonder of understanding. But the fundamental impulse is the same, the desire to understand our place in the cosmos, to find meaning in the vast darkness above us, to connect the movements of distant objects with our own brief lives on this small planet. Let's imagine, for a moment, one final scene that captures something essential about medieval comet fear. It's a winter night in the year 1472, in a monastery somewhere in the German lands. Snow lies thick on the ground, muffling sound, making the world seem especially quiet and still. Inside the monastery, in the scriptorium where manuscripts are copied and illuminated, a monk sits at his desk. He's an older man now, having spent most of his life in this monastery, copying texts, preserving knowledge, recording events. A comet has appeared in the sky, not a particularly famous one, not one that history will remember with a specific designation, but a comet nonetheless, visible for several weeks during this cold winter. The monk has been observing it each night when the clouds permit, noting its position, describing its appearance, trying to determine what it might signify. By candlelight, he writes in his chronicle, carefully forming Latin letters with practiced precision. In the year of our Lord 1472, during the season of Advent, a comet appeared in the constellation of the Lion, remaining visible for 30 nights. Its head was bright as Venus, and its tail stretched toward the north, extending across 2 hands' width of the sky. Many feared that this portended evil times, for comets are known to announce the wrath of God and coming calamities. We pray that the Almighty will show mercy to his people and turn away whatever doom this sign may herald. The monk pauses in his writing, sets down his pen, and rises from his desk. His joints ache, he's not young anymore, and the cold seeps into old bones. He wraps his cloak more tightly around himself and walks to the window, looking out at the night sky. The stars are brilliant tonight, sharp as diamond points against the black void. And there, among the familiar patterns, is the stranger, the comet, its ghostly tail streaming across the constellations like a banner carried by an invisible army. What does he feel as he looks at it? Fear, certainly, the kind of fear that comes from genuinely believing that what he's seeing is a message from God, a warning about something terrible to come. But perhaps there's also something else. Curiosity about what this object actually is. Wonder at its beauty, for it is beautiful in its way, this visitor from beyond the circles of the world. A sense of his own smallness before the vastness of creation. A quiet prayer that whatever the comet means, God will grant him and his brothers the strength to face what comes with faith and courage. He doesn't know, cannot know, that 500 years in the future, people will understand comets as natural objects, that they'll send machines to visit them, that the fear he feels will seem quaint and almost incomprehensible to those future generations. He doesn't know that the monastery where he stands will eventually crumble, that the order of monks he belongs to will transform or disappear, that the entire world he knows will pass away like smoke. But he does know this, he's part of something larger than himself, something that stretches back through centuries to the ancient world and forward through time to generations yet unborn. The chronicle he's writing will be read by monks who come after him, who will add their own entries, recording their own comets and interpreting their own signs. The work of observation, of recording, of trying to understand, this continues, generation after generation, each building on what came before. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about medieval comet fear: it wasn't static. It wasn't simply a superstition handed down unchanged through the centuries. It was part of an ongoing conversation, a continuing attempt to understand the world, to find meaning, to connect observation with interpretation. Medieval people were asking the same fundamental questions we still ask: what is this? What does it mean? How should we respond? Their answers were different from ours, shaped by different knowledge and different frameworks of understanding. But the questions themselves were entirely reasonable, entirely human. When you see something unprecedented in the sky, something that doesn't fit your understanding of how things work, it's rational to wonder what it signifies, to look for meaning, to try to fit it into some larger pattern. The medieval period spans roughly 1,000 years, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the beginnings of the Renaissance in the 15th. Throughout this immense stretch of time, attitudes toward comets evolved. Early medieval chroniclers often simply noted comet appearances with minimal comment. By the High Middle Ages, in the 12th and 13th centuries, more sophisticated interpretations were being developed, drawing on rediscovered ancient texts and on Islamic learning transmitted through Spain and Sicily. By the late Middle Ages, in the 14th and 15th centuries, comet observations were becoming more detailed and systematic, even as interpretations remained firmly within the framework of divine signs and astrological influence. This progression shows that medieval people weren't frozen in ignorance but were actively engaged in trying to improve their understanding, using the tools and methods available to them. Consider the technological and methodological limitations they faced. They had no telescopes, no cameras, no way to measure distances to celestial objects with any precision. They had no understanding of gravity, no knowledge of the solar system's structure, no concept of how the universe actually operates. Given these limitations, the idea that comets were atmospheric phenomena or divine signs was as reasonable as any other explanation they could develop. What's remarkable isn't that they got things wrong, of course they did, given their limited knowledge, but that they observed as carefully as they did, recorded as meticulously as they did, and tried as hard as they did to make sense of what they were seeing. The chronicles that survive from the medieval period contain hundreds of comet observations, often described in considerable detail. These records have been invaluable to modern astronomers trying to reconstruct the historical appearances of comets, allowing them to calculate orbits and predict future returns. So medieval comet observers, even as they interpreted what they saw through frameworks we now reject, were contributing to a body of knowledge that would eventually lead to correct understanding. Their observations were data, and while their interpretations of that data were flawed, the data itself was valuable and has proven useful to later generations. This is how knowledge advances, gradually, building on previous work even when previous interpretations prove incorrect. Let's think now about how comet fear affected different aspects of medieval life in ways we haven't yet fully explored. We've talked about the religious response, the prayers, the processions, the calls for repentance. We've discussed the political uses of comet interpretation. But what about medicine? How did medical practitioners of the medieval period understand the connection between comets and disease? Medieval medicine was based largely on the theory of humors inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Galen. Health was understood as a balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which corresponded to 4 qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. Disease resulted from imbalances in these humors, which could be caused by various factors including diet, climate, and celestial influences. Comets were thought by many medieval medical writers to affect health by corrupting the air. Remember, the dominant theory placed comets in the atmosphere, where they burned with a kind of impure fire. This burning, it was believed, could pollute the air with noxious vapors that would throw the humors out of balance and cause disease. When a comet appeared, physicians might recommend various preventative measures, avoiding certain foods, using aromatic substances to purify the air, bloodletting to prevent excess of particular humors, and so on. This connection between comets and disease seemed to be confirmed by observation. When plague struck. And plague was a recurring nightmare throughout the medieval period, not just in the famous Black Death of the 14th century but in many earlier and later epidemics. People naturally looked for explanations. If a comet had appeared before the plague arrived, the connection seemed obvious. The comet had corrupted the air, and the corrupted air had caused the disease. From a modern perspective, this is obviously wrong. Comets don't cause disease, and plague is caused by a bacterium transmitted by fleas. But notice that the medieval explanation wasn't entirely nonsensical. It was trying to explain a real phenomenon, the outbreak of epidemic disease, through a causal mechanism involving environmental factors. The specific mechanism was wrong, but the general approach of looking for environmental causes of disease wasn't unreasonable. Medieval people were also observing a real correlation, even if they misunderstood the causation. Comets are visible from Earth when they pass close to the Sun, which happens at predictable intervals depending on each comet's orbit. Plague outbreaks, while they seemed random to medieval people, were actually following patterns determined by the ecology of rats and fleas, by trade routes that spread infected fleas to new regions, by climate factors that affected rodent populations, and by the state of public health and sanitation in various communities. Over a long enough time period, it's not surprising that comets and plague outbreaks would sometimes coincide simply by chance. Add to this the human tendency to remember coincidences and forget when predictions fail, and you have a recipe for a persistent false belief that comets cause disease. The belief was wrong, but it emerged from reasonable attempts to understand and explain real phenomena. Let's consider also the agricultural implications of comet fear. Medieval Europe was overwhelmingly agricultural, with most people engaged in farming either as independent peasants or as serfs working land owned by lords. Agriculture was entirely dependent on weather and climate, and any significant variation in temperature or rainfall could mean the difference between a good harvest and famine. When comets were interpreted as predicting coming disasters, those disasters often included agricultural failures, poor harvests, livestock diseases, unusual weather. Some medieval writers tried to be more specific, suggesting that comets appearing in certain constellations or during certain seasons indicated particular types of agricultural trouble. A comet in spring might suggest a failed grain harvest, while one in autumn might indicate problems with wine production or fruit crops. These predictions were vague enough to be almost unfalsifiable. Agriculture is uncertain by nature, and in any given year, something will go wrong somewhere: too much rain in one region, drought in another, early frost killing crops in a third area, locusts devastating fields in a fourth. If a comet has appeared anywhere in the preceding months, it can be seen as having predicted whatever agricultural problem occurs. But the belief that comets predicted agricultural disasters could actually help create those disasters through a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. If farmers believed a comet predicted famine, they might plant less, figuring that their crops were doomed anyway. Or they might harvest prematurely, trying to get whatever yield they could before the predicted disaster struck, thereby reducing the quality and quantity of their harvest. Merchants might hoard grain, driving up prices and making it harder for ordinary people to afford food. Nobles might increase their demands for stored grain to provision their castles against anticipated troubles. All of these responses to comet fear could contribute to actual food shortages, even if the comet itself had no physical effect on agriculture whatsoever. This is one of the ways that beliefs, even false beliefs, can have real effects. They change behavior, and changed behavior changes outcomes. Now, let's turn to a question we haven't fully addressed. Were there any medieval voices arguing against comet fear? Were there skeptics who rejected the idea that comets were omens? The answer is yes, but they were definitely in the minority and often had to express their skepticism carefully to avoid accusations of impiety or heresy. The most sophisticated medieval skeptics didn't deny that comets existed or that they were worth studying. They questioned whether comets could reliably predict future events. Some philosophers and natural philosophers argued that while God certainly could use comets to communicate with humanity, there was no reliable way for humans to know whether any particular comet was indeed a divine sign or simply a natural phenomenon with no particular meaning. How could we distinguish between a meaningful comet and a meaningless one? Without some clear criteria, any interpretation was essentially guesswork. Other skeptics pointed to the failure rate of comet predictions. When prognosticators made specific predictions about what a comet foretold, those predictions often failed to materialize, or materialized in ways so different from the prediction that any connection seemed forced. A comet might be said to predict the death of a particular king, but the king might live for many more years, dying eventually of old age long after the comet had been forgotten. Or a comet might predict war in a specific region, but war might break out somewhere completely different, and the prognosticator would claim this still fulfilled the prediction because war had occurred somewhere. These skeptical arguments were usually made carefully, often embedded in larger works on natural philosophy or theology where they could be presented as part of a scholarly debate rather than as a direct attack on popular belief. Even skeptics rarely denied that comets could be signs from God. That would have been theologically dangerous. Instead, they argued that we couldn't reliably interpret those signs, that human understanding of divine intentions was limited, that we should be humble about claiming to know what God meant by any particular celestial phenomenon. This cautious skepticism didn't have much effect on popular belief during the medieval period, but it did lay important groundwork for later, more thoroughgoing skepticism in the Renaissance and early modern period. The arguments that medieval skeptics made would be taken up and elaborated by later thinkers who had more freedom to challenge traditional beliefs. There's an interesting gender dimension to comet fear that we should acknowledge as well. Medieval sources discussing comets are almost entirely written by men, monks, clerics, scholars, chroniclers. This isn't surprising given that literacy and education were largely male preserves in medieval society. But women certainly saw comets too and certainly had their own responses to them. Unfortunately, we have very few records of women's voices discussing comets. The writings that survive from medieval women, letters, chronicles, mystical visions, poems, occasionally mention celestial signs, but rarely in the kind of detailed, analytical way that male scholars wrote about them. This doesn't mean women weren't interested in comets or didn't have opinions about them, only that their voices weren't preserved in the historical record in the same way. We can speculate, based on what we know about medieval women's lives and concerns, that women might have experienced comet fear somewhat differently than men. Women were responsible for their households, for children, for the day-to-day survival of their families. When a comet appeared and was said to predict disaster, women would have been thinking about how to protect their children, how to stretch food supplies, how to keep their families safe. Their response to comet fear might have been more practical and immediate than the theological or astronomical speculations of male scholars. Some medieval mystical texts written by women describe visions involving celestial signs, though these are usually interpreted as symbolic communications from God rather than as natural phenomena. Women mystics like Hildegard of Bingen wrote about their visions of heaven's opening, of lights descending, of cosmic events that signified spiritual truths. While these aren't directly about comets, they show that women were thinking about celestial phenomena and finding spiritual meaning in them, even if they weren't writing astronomical treatises. Let's consider now the question of how comet fear varied across different regions and cultures within the medieval world. Europe wasn't monolithic, it contained many different kingdoms, languages, cultures, and traditions. Did comet fear manifest the same way everywhere, or were there regional variations? The evidence suggests both commonalities and differences. The basic framework of comet interpretation, that they were signs of coming disasters, was widespread across Christian Europe, shared from England to Italy, from Spain to Poland. This commonality reflected the shared religious and intellectual culture of Latin Christendom, where educated people read the same texts, studied at the same universities, and participated in the same intellectual traditions. But there were also regional variations in how comets were interpreted and what they were thought to predict. In regions frequently threatened by invasion. The eastern frontiers facing the Ottoman Empire, for instance, or areas exposed to Viking raids in earlier centuries, comets might be particularly associated with war and foreign conquest. In regions prone to particular diseases, malaria in marshy areas, for instance, or plague in densely populated trading cities, comets might be especially feared as harbingers of epidemic. Local traditions and folk beliefs also shaped comet interpretation. In some areas, specific comet shapes or colors were associated with particular kinds of disasters based on local lore passed down through generations. These folk traditions might not appear in learned Latin texts but would have been part of oral culture, shared among ordinary people in local languages. The Celtic regions, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany, had their own pre-Christian traditions of celestial observation and interpretation that were never entirely suppressed by Christianity. While these regions were certainly Christianized by the medieval period, remnants of older beliefs persisted, sometimes blending with Christian interpretations in complex ways. A comet might be seen simultaneously as a Christian sign of divine judgment and as a fulfillment of older prophecies from pre-Christian traditions. In Mediterranean regions with closer contact with the Islamic world, Spain during the period of convivencia when Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived together, or Sicily under Norman rule, or the ports that traded extensively with the Middle East, there might be more awareness of Islamic astronomical learning and different frameworks for understanding comets. These regions were often at the forefront of reintroducing classical Greek texts to medieval Europe through translations from Arabic, and with those texts came sometimes different approaches to celestial phenomena. Northern Europe, particularly Scandinavia, came to Christianity later than Southern Europe and retained more of its pre-Christian traditions throughout the medieval period. Norse sagas occasionally mention celestial signs, including what might be comets, though the descriptions are often ambiguous. The Norse worldview, with its myths of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods and the end of the world, might have made comets especially portentous, suggesting the cosmic battle between order and chaos that would culminate in the world's destruction and rebirth. Let's think about pilgrimage and comet fear. Pilgrimage was one of the most important religious practices in medieval Christianity. People would travel long distances, sometimes hundreds or thousands of miles, to visit sacred sites, Jerusalem, Rome, Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, and countless local shrines housing relics of saints. When a comet appeared and was interpreted as a divine warning, pilgrimage could be one response. Making a pilgrimage was a form of penance, a way of demonstrating devotion, a means of seeking divine favor or forgiveness. Some people might vow to undertake a pilgrimage if they survived whatever disaster the comet predicted. Others might set out immediately, hoping that the act of pilgrimage would avert or mitigate the coming catastrophe. Pilgrimage routes would have been places where news and interpretations of comets spread rapidly. Pilgrims coming from different regions would share what they'd heard about the comet, what scholars in their home city said it meant, what disasters had already occurred that might be its fulfillment, what prayers or rituals were being recommended. Shrines along pilgrimage routes might see increased traffic after a comet appeared, as people sought the intercession of saints to protect them from whatever doom was predicted. The economic impact of pilgrimage related to comet fear shouldn't be underestimated. Shrines depended on pilgrims for their economic survival, donations, payments for accommodations, purchases of pilgrim badges and tokens, offerings for special prayers. A comet that drove people to make pilgrimages could mean prosperity for shrine keepers, inn owners, merchants selling supplies to pilgrims, and all the others whose livelihoods depended on pilgrimage traffic. Conversely, if a comet was interpreted as predicting travel dangers, bandits, war along the roads, shipwrecks for those traveling by sea, it might discourage pilgrimage, harming the economies of shrine towns. The interpretation of comets thus had real economic stakes for communities dependent on pilgrimage. We should also consider the role of visual culture in medieval comet fear. Most people in the medieval period couldn't read, but they could see. Churches were filled with images, wall paintings, sculptures, stained glass, that told biblical stories and depicted saints, angels, and demons. These visual narratives shaped how people understood the relationship between heaven and earth, between the divine and the human. When a comet appeared in the sky, people would have connected what they saw to images they'd seen in churches. Apocalyptic imagery was common in medieval church decoration, depictions of the Last Judgment, with Christ in glory, angels blowing trumpets, the dead rising from their graves, demons dragging sinners to hell. These images often included celestial signs, stars falling from heaven, the sun and moon darkened, angels wielding flaming swords. A comet, with its sword-like or torch-like appearance, might well remind viewers of these apocalyptic images. The connection would be immediate and visceral. What you see in the sky resembles what you've seen in church, suggesting that the events depicted in those church paintings might be beginning, that the end times might be upon you. This visual association would amplify fear, making the comet not just an abstract sign but a vivid, concrete connection to terrifying images of judgment and damnation. Illuminated manuscripts also sometimes depicted comets, usually in chronicles or astronomical texts. These depictions varied in style and accuracy, some quite naturalistic, others highly stylized. But they served to reinforce the idea that comets were important, worthy of careful documentation and artistic representation. When a comet was depicted alongside images of disaster, armies clashing, cities burning, people dying of plague, it created a visual narrative linking the comet to catastrophe. After the development of printing, this visual culture of comet fear intensified and spread. Woodcut illustrations could be printed quickly and cheaply, allowing broadsides about comets to be distributed widely. These broadsides often featured dramatic images, a comet hanging over a city, with scenes of predicted disasters below, perhaps accompanied by a poem or text explaining the comet's significance. People who couldn't read the text could still understand the basic message from the images. Let's consider the role of music and sound in experiencing comet fear. Medieval culture was rich in sound, church bells marking the hours of prayer, sung masses and hymns, the calls of town criers, the music of minstrels and troubadours. How did sound intersect with comet fear? When a comet appeared, church bells might ring more frequently as people were called to prayer. Special masses would be sung, the liturgical music taking on added solemnity and urgency. Preachers would deliver sermons about the comet, their voices rising and falling, using all the techniques of rhetoric to move their congregations to fear, repentance, and hope for divine mercy. In the streets, minstrels might compose songs about the comet, spreading news of its appearance and interpretations of its meaning. These songs would circulate orally, carried from town to town by traveling performers, reaching even illiterate people who would learn the songs and pass them on. The songs might be somber laments, warning of coming doom, or they might be more complex, exploring different possible meanings of the comet, questioning various interpretations. Prophecies about comets might be chanted or sung in a kind of recitative style, giving them an almost magical quality. The rhythm and repetition of chanted prophecy would make it memorable, allow it to spread more easily, and give it a kind of authority that prosaic speech might lack. The soundscape of a city or village during a comet appearance would thus be distinctive: more bells, more singing in churches, more public preaching, more conversation in markets and taverns about what it all meant. The comet wasn't just a visual phenomenon but an auditory one, embedded in a rich cultural context of sound and speech. Now let's think about temporal aspects of comet fear, how the experience unfolded over time. A comet doesn't just appear and disappear instantly. It gradually becomes visible, grows brighter, reaches peak brightness, then slowly fades over weeks or sometimes months. The timeline of a comet's visibility would shape how fear developed and evolved. In the first days after a comet was noticed, there might be uncertainty. Is this really a comet, or just an unusual cloud formation, or perhaps a planet that people hadn't recognized? As more people observed it and it became brighter, confirmation would spread. Yes, this is definitely a comet. News would travel through whatever communication networks existed, messengers sent from city to city, merchants and travelers carrying word along trade routes, letters exchanged between monasteries and cathedral schools. As the comet grew brighter and more obvious, interpretations would proliferate. Scholars would consult their books, looking for precedents. Astrologers would cast charts and make predictions. Preachers would craft sermons. Local prophets and visionaries might claim divine revelations about the comet's meaning. These various interpretations would circulate, sometimes conflicting with each other, creating a complex discourse about what the comet signified. The peak of the comet's brightness would be the peak of anxiety as well. This is when it would be most visible, most impressive, most impossible to ignore. People who hadn't bothered to look for it earlier would see it now. The very old would remember previous comets and would share stories about what followed them. The very young would experience comet fear for the first time, learning from adults around them how to interpret and respond to this phenomenon. As the comet began to fade, there might be a sense of relief. The sign is passing, perhaps the worst is over. But there would also be continued vigilance, watching for whatever disaster the comet had supposedly predicted. If something bad happened while the comet was still visible, or in the weeks or months immediately after, the connection would seem confirmed. If nothing particular happened, there might be speculation that the disaster was still coming, or that it had been averted through prayer, or that the comet had been misinterpreted. This temporal dimension means that comet fear wasn't a single moment of terror but an extended period of heightened anxiety, interpretation, and response. It was a process that unfolded over time, with different phases and different emotional tones. Understanding this helps us appreciate that medieval people weren't simply panicking at the sight of a comet but were engaged in a complex, ongoing attempt to understand and respond to what they were seeing. Let's consider also the transmission of knowledge about comets across generations. How did one generation's experience of comet fear shape the next generation's expectations and responses? Grandparents who had seen comets in their youth would tell their grandchildren about them. These stories would emphasize the connections between comets and disasters, because those are the memorable associations, the ones that confirmed belief in comets as omens. I remember when I was young, a comet appeared, and that very year the plague came and took half the village. Such stories, repeated over generations, built up a cultural memory that reinforced comet fear. Chronicles and histories preserved these associations in writing, creating a documentary record that scholars could consult. When a new comet appeared, learned men would look back through chronicles to see what had followed previous comets. They would find entry after entry linking comets to catastrophes, because chroniclers preferentially recorded negative outcomes. Positive events or periods of peace and prosperity following comet appearances were less likely to be noted or emphasized. This transmission of selective memory created a feedback loop. Each generation's fear of comets was validated by previous generations' reports, and each generation added its own reports to the accumulating evidence. The pattern seemed to grow stronger and more confirmed over time, even though it was based largely on selective observation and reporting. Religious and educational institutions played a crucial role in this transmission. Monasteries and cathedral schools preserved texts, including chronicles, astronomical works, and theological commentaries that discussed comets. Students at medieval universities would learn about comets from their teachers, who had learned from their teachers, creating chains of transmission that stretched back centuries. This institutional transmission had the effect of stabilizing and standardizing beliefs about comets. Local folk beliefs might vary from region to region, but the learned tradition of comet interpretation became relatively consistent across Latin Christendom. A student in Paris and a student in Oxford in the 13th century would learn essentially the same things about comets, drawing on the same authorities: Aristotle, Pliny, Augustine, and other ancient and medieval writers. But institutions also preserved dissenting views and alternative interpretations, even if these were minority positions. A student reading through commentaries on Aristotle's meteorology might encounter different opinions about where comets were located or what caused them. This exposure to multiple viewpoints, even within a framework that generally accepted comets as significant phenomena, allowed for some intellectual flexibility and debate. We should consider too the eschatological dimension of comet fear, that is, how it connected to beliefs about the end of the world. Christianity is fundamentally an eschatological religion, oriented toward an anticipated endpoint when Christ will return, the dead will be raised, and the final judgment will occur. Medieval Christians lived with this expectation, though there were different views about when the end might come. Some medieval thinkers believed that the end of the world was far in the future, that history would continue for many generations yet. Others believed that the end times were imminent, that they were living in the last days before Christ's return. Comets could fit into either framework, but they were especially potent for those who believed the end was near. Apocalyptic calculation was a recurring feature of medieval thought. Scholars would study biblical prophecies, trying to determine when the end would come. Various prophetic texts, both canonical and apocryphal, seem to provide clues. The Book of Revelation mentions signs that would precede the end, including celestial signs. When a particularly bright or unusual comet appeared, apocalyptic interpreters would see it as fulfilling these prophecies, as evidence that they were indeed living in the final days. Certain dates had special significance. The year 1000 saw heightened apocalyptic expectations in some circles, though the evidence suggests this wasn't as widespread or intense as sometimes claimed. The year 1033, marking 1,000 years since Christ's crucifixion, also generated some apocalyptic fervor. Various other dates were proposed by different calculating schemes: 1260, 1492, and many others. When comets appeared near these prophetically significant dates, they seemed to confirm apocalyptic expectations. A comet in 999 or 1000 would have been interpreted by some as announcing the imminent end. A comet in 1033 would have similar significance. Even when the predicted end didn't arrive, the framework remained in place, ready to be applied to the next comet, the next significant date. This eschatological context gave medieval comet fear an extra layer of intensity. A comet wasn't just warning of war or plague or the death of a king, it might be announcing the end of the world itself, the final catastrophe from which there would be no recovery, only judgment and whatever came after. This ultimate fear lurked in the background of all comet interpretation, even when more mundane disasters were predicted. Let's think now about social class and comet fear. We've touched on this earlier, but it's worth exploring more fully. Did peasants, townspeople, nobles, and clergy experience comet fear in the same way? Peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, experienced comet fear primarily through oral culture and through what they heard in church. They couldn't read learned treatises about comets, couldn't access chronicles or astronomical texts. Their understanding of comets came from folk tradition, from stories passed down through generations, and from what their priests told them. Their fear would have been immediate and visceral. A comet meant bad things were coming, things that would affect their daily lives, their harvests, their survival. They had little agency to do anything about it except pray and work and hope. Urban townspeople, merchants, craftsmen, guild members, had somewhat more access to information. In larger towns and cities, there would be people who could read books and later printed materials circulating, travelers bringing news and interpretations from elsewhere. Townspeople might hear different interpretations, might have some ability to evaluate competing claims, might be slightly more sophisticated in their understanding. But they would still take comets seriously, still see them as warnings worth heeding. Nobles and royalty faced particular pressures regarding comet interpretation. They were expected to respond to comets in appropriate ways, ordering prayers, making public shows of piety, demonstrating concern for their subjects' welfare. But they also had to worry about political implications. If a comet was interpreted as predicting their downfall, it could embolden enemies and undermine their authority. They might try to shape interpretations in their favor, using comets as propaganda tools. The clergy occupied a special position. They were supposed to be the interpreters of divine signs, the mediators between heaven and earth. When a comet appeared, people looked to priests, monks, and bishops for explanation and guidance. This gave clergy considerable power but also responsibility. They had to provide interpretations that were theologically sound, that fit with church teaching, that served pastoral needs by helping people respond appropriately to fear without falling into despair or panic. Scholars and natural philosophers, a small elite, usually clerics themselves, had yet another perspective. They were interested in comets not just as omens but as natural phenomena worth studying in their own right. They wanted to know what comets were made of, where they were located, how they moved. They could hold simultaneously scientific curiosity about comets and religious belief in their significance as signs. These different perspectives didn't exist in isolation but interacted and influenced each other. A scholar's interpretation might filter down through sermons to ordinary people. A noble's political use of comet interpretation might be informed by learned advisors. Folk beliefs might bubble up and influence even educated interpretations. Medieval society was hierarchical but not rigidly sealed. Ideas and beliefs flowed across social boundaries, creating a complex, multi-layered culture of comet fear. As we approach the end of our exploration, let's reflect on what medieval comet fear tells us about the medieval world more broadly. It reveals a culture deeply concerned with meaning, with finding patterns and significance in natural phenomena. It shows us a world where the boundary between natural and supernatural was porous, where divine action in the world was expected and anticipated. It demonstrates sophisticated observation and recording practices, even when the interpretive framework was incorrect. It illustrates how belief systems are maintained through selective memory and confirmation bias. And it reminds us that fear, even fear based on mistaken beliefs, is real and has real consequences for how people behave and how societies function. Medieval comet fear also shows us something about the human condition that transcends any particular historical period. We all seek meaning, we all fear the unknown, we all try to anticipate and prepare for dangers. The specific forms these universal impulses take vary across cultures and time periods, but the impulses themselves are constant. Medieval people looking up at a comet and feeling fear are not fundamentally different from modern people looking at whatever threatens us and trying to understand and respond to it. The questions they asked about comets: what is this? What does it mean? What should we do? Are the same questions we ask about any phenomenon that challenges our understanding or threatens our well-being. Their answers were shaped by their knowledge, their culture, their beliefs. Our answers are shaped by our knowledge, our culture, our beliefs. Future generations may look back at some of our certainties with the same puzzlement we feel toward medieval comet fear, recognizing the same pattern of sincere inquiry leading to incorrect conclusions because of limitations we can't see from within our own cultural moment. This isn't to embrace relativism or to suggest that all beliefs are equally valid. We genuinely do understand comets better than medieval people did. Our scientific knowledge is more accurate, more comprehensive, more useful for making predictions. But recognizing that medieval people were rational within their own context, That they were sincerely trying to understand their world using the tools available to them, helps us appreciate that rationality itself is not enough. It must be combined with accurate information, appropriate methods, and frameworks that correspond to how the world actually works. Medieval comet fear teaches us humility. It reminds us that intelligent, thoughtful people can be profoundly wrong about important things. It suggests that we should hold our own certainties lightly, recognizing that future generations may judge some of our beliefs as mistaken as we judge medieval comet interpretation. It encourages us to be charitable toward those whose beliefs differ from ours, recognizing that belief systems emerge from complex interactions of culture, experience, available information, and human cognitive tendencies. At the same time, medieval comet fear teaches us about the importance of empirical observation, careful reasoning, and willingness to question inherited wisdom. The slow transformation from seeing comets as omens to understanding retrisi continuethum as natural objects following predictable paths was accomplished by people who observed carefully, measured precisely, and were willing to challenge traditional explanations when the evidence demanded it. This transformation didn't happen overnight and wasn't accomplished by a single individual. It was a gradual process involving many thinkers over many generations, each contributing a piece to the puzzle. The medieval observers who carefully recorded comet appearances, even as they interpreted them as omens, were doing essential work. Their observations became data that later scientists could use. The medieval skeptics who questioned whether comet interpretations were reliable were laying groundwork for more thoroughgoing skepticism. The scholars who tried to reconcile observation with theory, even when their theories were wrong, were practicing a form of inquiry that would eventually lead to better theories. Let's return once more to the immediacy of the experience, to help us feel rather than just understand what medieval comet fear meant. Imagine you're living in a small town in England in the autumn of 1456. Halley's Comet has appeared, though you don't call it that. To you, it's simply a terrifying new presence in the sky. The comet has been visible for weeks now, growing brighter each night, its tail stretching across a significant portion of the heavens. Your town has about 200 souls, clustered around a stone church and a market square. Everyone knows everyone else. You've lived here your entire life, as did your parents and grandparents before you. The rhythms of your existence are determined by the agricultural cycle, by the liturgical calendar of the church, by the unchanging patterns of a world that seems to have been the same forever. But now something unprecedented has appeared in the sky, and with it has come a sense that the unchanging world might be about to change catastrophically. The priest, an earnest young man, educated at a cathedral school, who came to your town just 2 years ago, has preached about the comet. He's told you that it's a warning from God, that you must examine your conscience, confess your sins, amend your life. The comet, he says, announces coming judgment. In the market square, on days when people gather to trade and gossip, conversation turns constantly to the comet. Old William, who must be 70 if he's a day, remembers a comet from his childhood, back in the old king's time. That comet, he says, was followed by a terrible winter when many died of cold and hunger. His voice drops when he talks about finding frozen bodies in the morning, neighbors who hadn't survived the night. Margaret the brewer, a practical woman not given to fancy, says her grandmother told her that comets mean war is coming. She's worried for her sons, young men of fighting age who might be pressed into service if the lords start quarreling again. The wars of the past generation are still fresh in memory, armies passing through, demanding provisions, sometimes burning what they couldn't carry, leaving devastation in their wake. Thomas the carpenter, who can read a little, has somehow gotten hold of a manuscript, borrowed from the priest, perhaps, or brought by a traveling merchant. It contains prophecies about comets, and he reads portions aloud in the tavern, his finger following the Latin words he half understands, offering translations that are probably as much interpretation as literal rendering. The prophecies speak of kingdoms falling, of pestilence and famine, of stars falling from heaven and the dead rising from their graves. Your own response to the comet is a mixture of fear, curiosity, and resignation. You're afraid because everyone around you is afraid, because the authority figures you trust, the priest, the elders, the learned men whose words filter down to you, all say this is something to fear. You're curious because you're human, and the comet is genuinely beautiful in a terrible way, unlike anything you've ever seen before. And you're resigned because you know, deep in your bones, that you have no control over whatever is coming. You can pray, you can work, you can try to be a better person, but if war or plague or famine is coming, there's little you can do to protect yourself. Each evening, you find yourself looking up at the comet, watching it move slowly against the background of stars. It's become almost a ritual. After supper, after the day's work is done, you step outside and look up. Sometimes you pray while you look. Sometimes you just watch, mesmerized by this visitor from beyond your understanding. Sometimes your children come out with you, and you try to explain what you've heard about comets, passing on to the next generation the fear and the wonder that you inherited from generations past. And then one night, perhaps 6 or 7 weeks after you first noticed it, the comet is perceptibly fainter. Over the following nights, it continues to fade, its tail shortening, its head growing dimmer. Within a week, it's barely visible. Within 2 weeks, it's gone, and the sky looks normal again, the familiar constellations unmarked by any intruder. But the fear doesn't disappear with the comet. If anything, it intensifies now, because the warning has been given and now you're waiting for its fulfillment. Will it be war? Plague? Famine? When will it come? How bad will it be? These questions hang over your town like a fog that won't lift. And then, perhaps 6 months later, news arrives. The king is dead. He'd been ill for some time, but his death still comes as a shock, throwing the succession into question. Or perhaps it's not the king's death but news of war breaking out in France, or that might spread to England and demand taxes and soldiers. Or perhaps it's an early warning of poor harvests to come, with reports from the south that the spring rains never arrived and the crops are failing. Whatever it is, the connection is immediate and obvious. The comet warned us. The comet predicted this. See, the old beliefs are confirmed once again. And the story of this comet and what followed it will be told for decades, will be written down in chronicles if your town has anyone to write chronicles, will be passed down to children and grandchildren, adding to the accumulated evidence that comets are indeed harbingers of doom. This is how it worked, comet after comet, generation after generation, throughout the medieval period. Individual experience, cultural transmission, selective memory, confirmation bias, genuine correlation between comets and disasters, given that disasters were common enough, and the deep human need to find meaning and pattern. All of these wove together into a fabric of belief that was coherent, self-reinforcing, and extraordinarily resistant to change. Yet change did eventually come, as change always does. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, building on medieval foundations, gradually developed new ways of understanding the cosmos. The realization that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, that the celestial spheres weren't solid crystalline shells, that the heavens weren't fundamentally different from Earth, that the same physical laws applied everywhere, these insights transformed how comets could be understood. When Newton showed that comets followed gravitational paths, obeying the same laws as planets, they became part of the regular clockwork of the universe rather than anomalous intruders. When Halley predicted that the comet of 1682 would return in 1758, and it did return on schedule, it demonstrated that comets were natural, predictable phenomena. The fear didn't disappear immediately, it would take many more generations for that, but it began to transform into something different. In our own time, we can see comets as the medieval people who carefully observed and recorded them never could. We've sent spacecraft to visit comets, to photograph them up close, to analyze their composition. We know they're ancient remnants of the solar system's formation, icy bodies that have been orbiting the sun for billions of years. We can calculate their orbits with extraordinary precision, predict when they'll return, determine whether they pose any danger to Earth. We understand them in ways that would have seemed like magic to medieval observers. And yet, when a bright comet does appear, as they still occasionally do, there's still something primal in our response. We still feel compelled to go outside and look. We still feel a sense of awe and wonder. We still feel, perhaps just for a moment, a whisper of that ancient fear, even though we know intellectually that the comet is harmless, that it's just ice and rock and dust reflecting sunlight as it passes through the inner solar system. This persistence of wonder, and that whisper of fear, connects us across the centuries to those medieval observers who looked up at the same phenomenon and felt terror and fascination. We're separated from them by knowledge and by culture, by the immense transformations that have reshaped how we understand the world. But we're connected to them by our common humanity, by the fact that we're all creatures who look up at the night sky and wonder what it means, what our place is in this vast cosmos, whether the lights we see above us have anything to say to us. Medieval people believed comets were messages, communications from the divine realm to humanity. We believe they're remnants of the solar system's formation, time capsules containing clues to how our world came to be. Both views see comets as meaningful, as telling us something important, but the nature of that meaning has fundamentally changed. Their meaning was immediate, personal, moral. This comet means you need to repent, prepare yourself, brace for disaster. Our meaning is historical, scientific, impersonal. This comet tells us about conditions in the early solar system, about the chemistry of the solar nebula, about the processes that formed planets. Neither meaning is complete. The medieval meaning didn't help them understand what comets actually are, didn't give them predictive power, often led them to false conclusions. But it connected cosmic phenomena to human life in ways that our scientific understanding doesn't. Our scientific meaning gives us true understanding and predictive power, but it can feel disconnected from human concerns, from the question of what the cosmos means for us, for our lives, for how we should live. Perhaps what we need is both, the rigor and accuracy of scientific understanding combined with something of that medieval sense of connection, of meaning, of wonder. Not the fear, not the false predictions, not the self-fulfilling prophecies and confirmation bias, but the underlying recognition that we're part of something larger than ourselves, that the cosmos and humanity are connected, that looking up at the night sky and seeing a comet should still move us, should still mean something, even if what it means is different from what our medieval ancestors thought. As we come to the end of our journey through medieval comet fear, let's take one final moment to appreciate what we've discovered. We've seen how comet fear emerged from multiple sources: ancient learning, religious belief, recorded history, visual associations, political uses, and genuine observation of real phenomena. We've seen how it operated at different levels of society, from peasants to kings, from women to men, from skeptics to believers. We've seen how it connected to other aspects of medieval life: religion, politics, economics, medicine, agriculture, art, literature, music. We've also seen how comet fear was maintained across generations through transmission of texts and oral traditions, through institutions that preserved and taught knowledge, through the accumulating weight of historical records that seemed to confirm that comets predicted disasters. And we've seen how comet fear began to transform in the late medieval period as more careful observation and new ways of thinking started to challenge traditional interpretations. Most importantly, we've tried to understand medieval comet fear from within, to see it as medieval people saw it rather than just judging it from our modern perspective. We've tried to appreciate that the fear was reasonable given what they knew, that it served genuine psychological and social needs, that even when it led to wrong conclusions, it emerged from sincere attempts to understand and respond to the world. The medieval world is gone now, lost in the mists of time. The people who feared those comets have been dead for centuries, their bones long since turned to dust, their names mostly forgotten except for the few who were powerful or holy or fortunate enough to be recorded in texts that survived. The kingdoms they served have been replaced by new political entities. The cities they lived in have been transformed beyond recognition or have disappeared entirely. The Latin language they used for learning has given way to modern languages. The religious certainties that shaped their world have been challenged and complicated by centuries of Reformation, Enlightenment, and secularization. But the comets they saw still orbit the sun, following the same paths, returning on the same schedules. The stars they wondered at are the same stars we see, minus the ones too distant to observe without telescopes. The moon that lit their nights is the same moon that lights ours. And the questions they asked about their place in the cosmos, about meaning and purpose, about how to live well in the face of uncertainty and danger, are questions we still ask, even if we ask them differently. In understanding why people feared comets in the Middle Ages, we've learned not just about comets or about medieval history, but about ourselves, about how humans make sense of the world, about how beliefs are formed and maintained, about how knowledge changes over time, about how fear and wonder and the search for meaning are constants of human experience across all times and places. And now, dear traveler, our journey comes to its end. We've walked together through medieval villages and cities, stood in churches and monasteries, looked up at comet-marked skies, listened to the voices of monks and kings and merchants and peasants as they tried to understand what those strange lights meant. We've seen their fear and felt something of what drove it. We've recognized both the differences between their world and ours, and the similarities that connect us across the centuries. As you drift now toward sleep, or simply toward the rest of your evening, carry with you this knowledge, that fear, even fear of things we don't understand or understand wrongly, is part of being human. That the search for meaning never ends, only transforms. That each age does the best it can with what it knows, and we should have compassion for those who came before us, who struggled as we struggle, who feared as we fear, who hoped as we hope, who looked up at the night sky and wondered, as we still wonder, what it all means. The comets that frightened medieval Europe still visit our skies from time to time, though we call them by numbers and names rather than seeing them as omens. Perhaps, on some clear night in the future, you'll step outside and see one for yourself, a pale smudge of light with a ghostly tail, moving slowly against the fixed stars. When you do, remember for a moment those medieval observers, and feel the connection across time, the shared experience of looking up and seeing something that reminds us how vast the universe is, and how small we are, and how precious our brief moment of consciousness in this immense cosmos. Rest now. Let your mind release the weight of history, the burden of fear, the complexity of belief and culture and change. Let yourself float on the gentle current of these stories, these voices from the past whispering across centuries, these fragments of lives lived long ago but not so different from lives lived today. Sleep comes like the fading of a comet, gradually, gently, carrying you away from waking consciousness into dreams where time moves differently, where past and present blur together, where you might find yourself in a medieval village looking up at a comet-marked sky, feeling that ancient wonder, that timeless awe. Thank you for traveling with me through this long night of history. May your rest be peaceful, your dreams be gentle, and your waking be refreshed. And if these tales have brought you comfort or fascination, remember that there are always more stories waiting, more journeys into the past to be taken, more quiet hours of learning and wonder to be shared. Until we meet again, be well, be curious, and never stop looking up at the stars. Good night, traveler. Sleep well.